mirando las estrellas, me atrajo la importancia del agua. Parece que el agua vino del espacio exterior y que la vida nos llegó en los cometas que formaron los mares.
Bueno, no es fácil hablar del documental.
So it's not easy to talk about documentary.
El documental es un género intermedio.
So it's somewhere between fiction and reporting.
Es completamente diferente del reportaje.
But saying that it's completely different from reportage.
De la prensa.
From press stories.
Es otra forma de hacer cine.
It's another way of conceiving cinema making.
Por ejemplo, si filmamos en una calle,
for example, if we're filming in the street,
donde una mujer se recoge del suelo algo,
and you see a woman picking something up from the ground,
para mí es una célula documental.
For me, that's the kind of germ of a documentary.
También, por ejemplo, si vemos que una señora trata de abrir un coche con un alambre.
Imagine, for example, that you see somebody trying to jimmy open a car door with a wire.
Una señora muy anciana,
a very old woman,
comienza a mirar hacia atrás.
And she starts kind of looking over her shoulder.
Y se queda quieta.
And then she's kind of still.
Son átomos dramáticos.
You can think of these as being dramatic atoms.
Y equivalen a palabras.
And they're equivalent to words.
Y cuando une todas estas palabras, uno.
And when one, as an individual, puts those words together,
construye una frase.
You construct a phrase.
Y eso es un trocito documental.
And those are the pieces that make up a documentary.
Eso es el documental.
That's what a documentary is.
Ninguna otra cosa más.
Nothing more than that.
¿Podríamos terminar ahora esta charla?
We could stop the talk here.
Porque es lo más importante.
That really is the key thing.
El documental capta determinados trocitos de vida.
A documentary captures specific slices of life.
Muy pequeñitos.
But think of them as very small ones.
Y se van acumulando.
And they accumulate, they build up bit by bit.
Hasta construir una película.
Until they create what is ultimately the film.
Si alguien no está de acuerdo o le parece que lo que yo digo es incompleto, que levante la mano.
If you feel what I'm saying is incorrect or incomplete, just put up your hand and have your say.
Me encantan las interrupciones.
I really like being interrupted.
¿Tienen algún problema con la definición que acabo de decir?
Any issues with the definition of documentary thus far?
Qué unanimidad.
A unanimous verdict.
Bueno, vamos a hablar de algo muy importante. ¿El documental es objetivo o subjetivo?
So we have to address something really important. ¿Es una pregunta o es un...?
Es una afirmación mía.
Documentary can be objective and subjective.
Exacto. ¿Qué es realmente?
But which of those really is it?
Mucha gente decía que el documental tiene que ser objetivo.
Many people have said that documentaries should be objective.
Tenía que contar unos hechos reales.
And its purpose was to narrate some real events or facts.
Y hoy día es todo lo contrario.
And Patricio would say it's exactly the opposite of that.
Uno cuenta hechos subjetivos.
What one does is to tell subjective facts.
Lo que uno cree que es, lo cuenta.
What you feel something is what is the story that you tell.
El documental no es un instrumento mecánico industrial.
Documentary isn't a mechanical industrial mechanism.
Todo lo contrario.
Just the opposite.
es una expresión personal,
It's a form of personal expression,
es una manera de ver la realidad,
a way of seeing reality,
nuestra realidad.
our reality.
Y eso es fantástico,
And that's fantastic.
porque nos da mucho campo de acción, mucho trabajo, es bonito.
Because that offers a really kind of large field for activity and for storytelling.
¿Estás de acuerdo?
Sí, eso de objetivo es un viejo mito. Tú siempre has dicho que solamente las cámaras en los bancos pueden ser eventualmente objetivos.
Es verdad, es verdad. Traduce.
The only real documentary that's properly like that, if you think about it logically, is the CCTV cameras that you've got like in a bank that are just there pointing in one direction and just filming the same shot all the time. That's the only kind of documentary that really fills that definition.
Exacto.
Sí, podría ser objetivo.
Exacto, o sea, una cámara de un banco podría ser objetivo.
One of those security cameras in a bank, that could be objective in a sense.
Pero no nosotros.
But not us as filmmakers.
Sí. Es importante eso,
And that's really important.
porque concede la importancia al documentalista, le da importancia.
Thinking of it that way is important because that centers the filmmaker within the process of the narration.
Eso es lo que nos hace sentirnos cineastas.
That's really what the difference between a technician and a filmmaker.
Exacto, exacto. ¿Tienen alguna pregunta?
Any questions about that?
Qué curso más agradable.
You're a very nice audience.
¿Quieres que entrara más en materia?
¿Puedo hacer una pregunta?
¿Cómo no?
En el libro, filmar lo que no se ve, se llama el libro. So Patricio has a book that came out 2 years ago called Filming the Unseen. It's a shame it isn't available in English because it's a really nice mixture of very thought-provoking ways of describing the filmmaker's work, but it's also very, very clearly set out. So it'd be absolutely brilliant for cinema students and for people who actually make films. But Patricio says in the course of that book that a filmmaker is a witness who participates. So I was going to ask him to kind of talk a bit more about that. Usted dice que el cineasta es testigo que participa.
Exacto. Uno participa de lo que ocurre.
So the filmmaker is kind of playing a role or is actually taking part in what's happening.
Uno no está atrás,
You're not kind of at the margins,
como un científico
like a scientific analyst
que analiza y que observa objetos que pasan.
that's just there looking disinterestedly at objects as they are developing.
En un microscopio.
For example, like looking down a microscope.
Uno también participa.
You're also a participant.
Es raro, pero es así.
It's curious, but that's how it is.
Pero ¿cómo te fue esa cosa cuando viviste? Porque Patricio es el único que vivió una revolución social que pocas veces en una vida humana le toca a uno.
Yeah. So something is also distinctive about Patricio and his work is that he's somebody who has lived through and witnessed firsthand a revolution, and that's not all that common.
Y sí, tal vez sería bueno que tú describes lo que acabas de decir, que el cineasta de un documental es un testigo que participa. ¿Cómo te fue eso con la revolución de Salvador Allende que viviste y que filmaste?
And how does this idea of the filmmaker being both a witness and kind of an actor or a participant in events, how did that play out in the events around the Allende government and the coup, being there and seeing it?
Está claro, ¿no? Sí. Hay muchos que hablan español. Sí, qué bueno. Yo tenía una posición frente a la revolución de Allende.
I had a position vis-a-vis the Allende revolution.
Por lo tanto, no era objetivo.
And in that sense, I wasn't objective.
Yo creo que casi nunca el documentalista es objetivo.
I think the documentary maker is very rarely objective.
Uno participa.
you are taking part,
del tema que hace.
within the subject matter that you're looking at.
Si uno está apasionado por un árbol,
If you don't have a strong feeling, for example, about a tree,
uno ama ese árbol
unless you love that tree,
y por lo tanto es subjetivo.
in that sense it's a subjective perspective.
No se puede hacer un documental de un árbol desde lejos.
You can't make a documentary about a tree from far away.
Es aburrido,
That would be boring.
no tiene opinión.
There would be no opinion in that.
Siempre hay que tener una opinión de lo que uno filma.
You always have to have an opinion about what it is that you're filming.
No importa que no sea objetivo.
It doesn't matter that you're not objective.
No, no. Las noticias dirán que hablarán de lo mismo y serán objetivas.
You can leave that to the news, which do purport to be objective and simply to narrate facts.
Porque el documental es una obra de arte.
Because a documentary is a work of art.
Y eso significa que el artista, el creador, es el que da una opinión de lo que está viendo.
And what that means is that the filmmaker is an artist and is
De lo que uno ve.
olvidé
No importa.
cómo terminó la frase.
Lo dejamos en misterio.
Never mind, leave it like that. It creates some mystery.
Bueno, yo soy chileno, pero estudié cine en España.
So, to answer that, I am Chilean, but I studied filmmaking in Spain.
Y volví a Chile
And I went back to Chile
justo cuando Allende salió.
just when Allende was
Fue presidente.
just when he was elected as president.
Y lo que yo sentí fue de qué manera contar lo que está pasando en este país.
And my feeling was how on earth to tell the story about what was happening in the country.
¿Qué hacer para contar realmente lo que está pasando?
What to do to properly recount what was happening around me.
Y esto dio como resultado una película de 4 horas.
And the end result of that was a film that lasts about 4 hours.
4 horas y media.
4 hours.
Pero ¿qué queremos decir con esto?
And so what does that mean?
Que lo primero es que hay que tener, para empezar un documental, una idea.
So to make a documentary, then, before anything else, you have to have an idea.
Después hay que hacer una investigación.
And then you have to do some research.
Luego hay que escribir lo que uno piensa.
And then you have to put down on paper, write what it is that you think.
Mucha gente dice que el documental no debe escribirse.
There are quite a lot of people who say that a documentary shouldn't be a script or written.
Yo creo que sí.
But I think, on the contrary, that it should be.
Yo hago guiones gordos de 30 páginas.
I come up with quite thick screenplays, sometimes they're 30 pages long,
de un documental que voy a hacer.
of a documentary that has yet to be made.
Y también hago una sinopsis,
And I also make a synopsis.
que en gran parte son inventados,
And to a large extent, those are pure invention,
porque no se puede saber todo eso antes de ir a filmar.
because you can't really know what's going to be in the film until you get into the process of making it.
Pero ayuda mucho,
But it's a great help,
porque da una dirección.
because it gives you a trajectory.
Entonces, en la cabeza de uno hay algo claro,
So that you've got a clear sense in your mind of where you're going.
pero así no va a ser la película. La película no va a reflejar ese guión.
So when it comes down to it, the actual film may not be a reflection of what was in the script.
Porque las ideas que uno tiene antes,
Because the ideas that you had in the first place,
con lo que la realidad da después,
with the reality that you're confronted with later,
se juntan.
come together.
Y eso es un documental.
And that is documentary.
¿Les queda claro o no?
Is that very clear with that?
Sí, porque hay caras muy raras. Cuando uno está estudiando el tema que va a hacer,
When you're studying the theme of the film that you're going to be making,
hay que tener muy claro el punto de vista que uno tiene.
you have to be really clear about your point of view on this.
que no es imparcial,
You're not impartial.
es subjetivo.
It's a subjective point of view.
Es la propia opinión de uno
It's one's own opinion
de un tema.
about a theme.
Es muy importante hacerle caso a la opinión de uno.
It's really important to pay attention to what your opinion is,
No somos científicos,
because we're not scientists.
nosotros somos artistas
We are artists
o creadores
or creative people,
y tenemos una idea de algo
and we have an idea about something,
y hay que respetarla.
and that has to be respected.
Y a eso lo llamo tener un punto de vista sólido.
And I call that having a solid point of view.
Y luego, esto es lo contradictorio.
And this is where you get into some contradictions.
Hay que tener distancia.
At the same time, you also need to have some distance.
O sea, uno ama mucho un tema, un árbol,
In other words, you can really like your subject, let's say for illustration purposes, this tree,
y luego hay que alejarse de él.
but at the same time, you need to kind of remove yourself from it a bit.
Mientras más lejos, mejor.
Actually, the further away, the better.
Y eso le da a uno mayor perspectiva,
And the benefit of that is it gives you a wider perspective.
pero no objetividad.
But that's not the same as objectivity.
Es un mecanismo propio.
It's your own mechanism.
Y con eso trabajo.
And this again is my way of working.
Voy a seguir, ¿no? Si no hay preguntas.
Shall I carry on if there are any questions?
Ah, muy bien. Tú primero.
I have a question. If you had this experience, like if you experience something personally, like the Allende crisis and the things, how does it influence your filmmaking if you have personal experience with the topic or if you just researched a topic and got interested into it? Sorry, my Spanish, I just understand, I can't talk.
Yo creo que lo principal es que tú tengas una experiencia, que tú tengas una opinión.
The principal point is that you have that experience and you have an opinion.
No, por ejemplo, si hacemos una película de las Islas Galápagos,
For example, let's say we're making a film about the Galapagos Islands.
sí, uno tiene que estudiar todo,
Yes, I mean you have to study everything about it.
pero a mí no me interesan para nada las Islas Galápagos.
But by the same token, I'm not interested at all in the Galapagos Islands.
En un canal de documentales comercial, como hay tantos,
In one of these commercially oriented documentary channels, and there are a lot of them,
le llaman a un director y le dicen haga una película de las Galápagos.
their way of working is they'll pick up the phone and call a director and say, make us a film about the Galapagos.
Nunca hay que aceptar eso, tipo de-
You should never accept that way of working,
aunque nos muramos de hambre,
even if it means going hungry.
porque el documental tiene que ser algo tuyo, propio, sentido.
Because a documentary needs to belong to you, to be something that you feel,
Que tenga que ver con tu vida.
that has something to do with your life.
¿Respondí bien o no?
Was that a good answer?
What you were saying about being a witness and being a participant at the same time, it sounded a lot like ethnography. I wonder, is that something that you see in your work? And then do you think, can art and research be the same thing, or should they be? Can art be researching or research be art?
Puede ser, no me opongo. No estoy, digamos, estoy de acuerdo.
Yeah, Patricio agrees, and he's not opposed to that idea,
Porque el documental tiene muchas disciplinas adentro de sí.
because within documentary it has there are all kinds of disciplines within that definition,
Y eso no hace que el documental sea menor.
and that's not to say that documentary is a minor form for all that.
Lo que yo hago es investigar para entender mejor el tema.
My reason for researching is to understand what it is that my subject better,
O para hacer lo que yo quiera,
or to do what I want to do,
a pesar de lo que es el tema.
in spite of what the subject is.
Pero quiero saber de qué se trata para no hacer el ridículo.
But I want to understand the subject matter so as not to make to do anything foolish.
Cuando Patricio preparó Nostalgia de la Luz,
When Patricio was working on Nostalgia for Light,
tenemos en casa unos 50 libros mínimo de astronomía.
at home we've got at least 50 astronomy books.
Sí, y cada semana unos 5 revistas científicas de astronomía popular.
And every week we get, by subscription, maybe 5 magazines about popular astronomy.
Y la película, la preparación duró unos 3 años, en total 5 años, pero los 3 años era eso, alrededor de la astronomía. Y al final, en la película, la parte cuando se ven los observatorios es relativamente corto.
So the film altogether then was probably 5 years in development, and 3 of those 5 years were involved with research. And the bit that you see in the film, which is the observatories, that actually kind of came towards the end. That was
Es relativamente corto en una película de 90 minutos.
right. So it's quite a small episode in a 90-minute film, but that was maybe 3 years worth of research and just kind of
Pero eso es la relación correcta.
and that's how it should be.
Sí, uno lee mucho, estudia mucho.
Y
Y después hay que reducir al mínimo.
And then it becomes a process of kind of whittling it down to a core.
Pero sobre todo uno lee para hacer lo que quiere.
But your main reason for reading is to be able to do it in the way that you want to.
No para repetir lo que los libros dicen,
It's not about recycling what you are reading in the books,
sino para sentirse más libre.
but to give you the freedom that comes with that.
Ella está haciendo boicot. Dilo.
Es lo contrario normalmente del proceso universitario.
So you could think of this as being a kind of turning upside down what usually happens in university work.
Está bien. ¿He respondido bien? Sí. Había otra por acá.
About having an idea and telling your idea, how much collaboration is there in your team? How big is your team? How many people do you like to work with, and do you work with the same people on each film?
Generalmente trabajo con un cameraman,
So generally speaking, I work with the same cameraman,
un sonidista, ingeniero de sonido,
a sound engineer,
¿y quién más? Y yo.
Más tarde la
Amén.
Y después la montadora.
and later on in the process, the editor,
Y después la persona que hace la mezcla de sonido.
and then later than that, the person who's mixing the sound.
Trato de que sean siempre las mismas.
And I do try always to work with those are the same people.
Es muy importante el asistente,
The role of the assistant is a very important one,
porque es la persona con la que yo discuto, con la que hablo lo que voy a hacer.
because that's the person who I'll be talking about the project with and deciding how we're going to do it.
Y después cuando estoy haciendo el montaje,
And then later on, when we're doing the edit,
todos los días llevo a mi casa un disco
I take back home every day a disc
con lo que ya he montado
with what they put together,
y lo discuto con Renate,
and I talk about it with Renate,
que es la productora.
who's my producer.
Ese es el sistema.
That's the way that it works.
Es muy simple.
It's very, very simple.
En total somos 6, 7 personas.
Altogether, maybe 6 or 7 people in the team.
Basta y sobra.
That's plenty, if not more than that.
Exacto. Es muy bueno tener poca gente.
It's a good thing to have that small number of people.
No hay cosa peor que tener un montón de gente detrás
There's nothing worse than having a huge number of people
que no sirven para nada.
who aren't really doing anything.
El ideal es que esté el director, el ayudante, el cámara y el sonidista.
So the key thing is to have the director, the sound man or sound woman,
cámara
the cameraman
y
or
el
woman,
asistente.
and the assistant director.
Los que cabemos en un auto. Los que caben.
Yeah, it's good too because that you can easily fit the team that size into a car.
Es muy importante eso.
And that is important.
Cuando viene otro carro atrás,
If you've got another car, you know, a caravan of cars,
se pierde.
you get lost.
Siempre.
The following car will always get lost.
You've talked about a theme or an idea in your film, but that seems to me a little inaccurate, really, because the extraordinary thing about your films is how many themes and how many ideas you bring together. So culture, geography, history, astronomy, all these things, and mostly people make a film about one theme, one idea, but you manage to kind of bring lots of the cosmic, the microscopic, all together. Could you just talk a little bit how that kind of comes out through you?
Es verdad, es verdad. Siempre trato de unir otros temas al tema central.
What you're saying is right, and it's you should always be trying to bring together a number of ideas around one central idea.
Creo que es mejor.
And that's better.
Además son ideas que van apareciendo solas.
And if you work that way, then you also find that you get ideas occurring naturally that come into it.
Si uno va a hacer una película de por ejemplo, el edificio de la universidad.
Let's say you're making a film about the university building.
Ese es el tema central.
And that's the central theme.
Pero está lleno de cosas que van a aparecer.
But it's full of things that are going on around it.
Desde los ascensores.
From the lifts going up and down.
Hasta los pasillos.
To corridors.
La cocina.
Kitchen.
Y hay que entrar con ellos también.
And you also want to be looking at that as well. In the book, Patricio talks about an idea that sounds quite like Cartier-Bresson's idea of the decisive moment, that the photographer or the filmmaker is there when something happens that kind of tips the balance between a before and an after. And he describes how kind of being embedded in an event makes that possible. When you're kind of really inside something that's happening, you are going to be there ready to point the camera at something that happens. And in the film that's being shown after this, the narrative refers to a Chilean photographer called Patricio Guzmán, who kind of cottoned on to the idea of the interest and the importance of making portraits of Chile's indigenous people well before the historians. So there's a sense in which I think you're kind of getting at the idea that perhaps people who work in the visual arts are anticipating history, but they're also there to kind of capture it as it happens. So there's like this two-pronged relationship with history.
Difícil explicar cómo Patricio reúne esos elementos diferentes y cómo siente las cosas que son importantes para la película.
So Renate is saying, I think it's difficult to explain how it is that Patricio brings together all these different strands and makes them into a kind of coherent film.
Y sobre todo, él está en una posición que no lo sabe.
He's kind of occupying a position without being aware that he's there.
Pero no lo sabe, y es bueno que no lo sabe.
And that's a good thing not to know that.
Porque tiene que ver con la intuición y con la creatividad.
Because there's something here about intuition and creativity.
Porque no hay mucha explicación cómo puede unir un exoplaneta, el cosmos, el meteorito, el Big Bang, con una mujer que busca desesperadamente los huesos de un desaparecido, su hermano, su papá, bajo la dictadura de Pinochet.
So on the face of it, there's not immediately an obvious way of connecting the ideas about a meteorite in space and the cosmos, with at the same time trying to find the remains of some of the disappeared whose fragments and body parts turned up in the Atacama desert.
Eso es lo que Patricio dice cuando dice uno tiene que amar su tema.
And that's what Patricio is getting at when he says you really have to love your subject.
Él tiene una fascinación para la astronomía, para el cosmos.
And he has a real fascination for astronomy and for the cosmos.
Y otra pasión es de haber vivido la experiencia revolución chilena con su brutal golpe.
And another facet of his experience is having lived through the Allende revolution and then the brutal coup d'etat.
Y tener el deseo
And having the desire
de transmitir cómo ha sido posible y qué podemos hacer.
of getting across how that happened and what could we do about it.
Y toma eso y hacerlo como fuente de su actividad creativa cineasta, como base de su cine.
And essentially what he's doing is taking that and making that the foundation or the base of his filmmaking practice.
Y ahí yo pienso que el milagro creativo no tiene guión ni explicación.
And in that sense, I would say that you can't kind of reduce, you can't kind of come up with a simple formula for how to make a film because of these elements of intuition and creativity.
Es su intimidad y es bueno que no sabe explicar.
It's something very intimate, and in a way, it's actually a good thing that it can't be explained.
Pero no, yo no quiero que esto quede como un misterio.
No.
But I don't want this to kind of come across as being a big mystery.
Porque simplemente cuando uno hace una película,
So, to put it simply, when you're making a film,
comienza a ver cosas laterales
you begin to see things laterally,
y las une.
and what you do is bring those together,
Eso es todo.
and that's it essentially.
Es mucho más sencillo.
It's much simpler.
Y no quiero transmitir una idea de que el documental es algo complicado, metafísico. No.
And I don't want you to kind of get the idea that I'm saying that there's something metaphysical or really, really complicated about making a documentary. Not at all.
Es fácil hacer documental.
It's easy to make a documentary.
Which film to date has been the hardest to make, and have you started off with one vision that has changed during filming?
O ha quedado siempre igual.
No. La más difícil de todas es la batalla de Chile.
The one that was the most difficult to make was the Battle of Chile.
Son 4 horas y media
It was 4.5 hours long,
de un proceso político muy complejo,
and it was a very complicated production process.
con una derecha implacable, con Estados Unidos que desea hacer caer a Allende.
With an implacable gang of, well, you didn't say gang, sorry. With an implacable group of rightists who were just dead set on doing away with Allende.
Y Estados Unidos.
And allied with the US.
Y un pueblo con ganas de hacer un cambio.
And on the other hand, a people who had a very strong desire to see some change.
Era difícil de explicar esta situación.
And it was really challenging to explain that setup.
Y esa película me tomó 7 años de vida.
And that film occupied 7 years of my life making it.
Y estoy muy contento,
I'm really happy with that,
porque la película dura todavía.
because the film's value is lasting,
En Estados Unidos tiene una gran circulación en vídeo.
and it's widely seen on video in the US,
DVD.
for example.
Y siempre, por ejemplo en Chile, está de moda la tercera parte de la batalla de Chile.
Speaking specifically about Chile, the third part is particularly in vogue there,
¿Y por qué?
Porque los estudiantes están en el mismo proceso.
because the students are going through something similar.
Ujú. Yes. En resumidas cuentas, en resumen, la batalla de Chile es lo más importante que he hecho.
So, to put it in a nutshell, La Batalla de Chile, the Battle of Chile, that's the most important film I've made.
Hay que seguir. Vamos a ver. Una vez que uno ha hecho un guión aproximado de la película,
So carrying on with the discussion then, once you've got your script more or less of what the film's going to be,
que yo denomino guión imaginario.
And my term for that is an imaginary script.
La película comienza a circular, el guión,
The film starts to circulate in the sense of the script being shared.
se obtiene el dinero para hacerlo
Get the money that you need to make it,
y viene el rodaje.
and then comes the shooting. Or
Y en la filmación yo distingo varios capítulos.
I think of the filmmaking process from that point of being divided into different categories.
La primera cosa es descripción,
So the first one of these is description,
aprender a describir.
learning to describe.
Describir cualquier cosa,
Describing anything.
el suelo,
It could be the ground,
la cortina,
the curtains,
el trípode.
the tripod.
Describir,
Describe.
es decir, aprender a poner la cámara de tal manera que tú sepas qué es un automóvil, un trípode o la cortina.
So you need to learn about where you put the camera to describe whatever it is, whether it's a car or the tripod or a curtain.
Es muy importante describir.
Description is very important.
Es casi fundamental en el documental.
It's a fundamental part of the documentary.
Si, por ejemplo, uno describe un parque,
Let's say, for example, you're describing a park.
uno puede poner encima de esa descripción los ruidos del parque.
You could put on top of that description the sounds in the park,
Exacto. O mi propia voz que va a hablar del parque.
or it could be my own voice talking about the park.
Alguna persona que llega atrasada también es una buena descripción.
Or somebody that comes in late, that also could be a good bit of the description.
Y uno describiendo se hace un documental.
And that is making a documentary. It's a process of description.
Es muy importante salir a la calle con una cámara cualquiera, pequeñita,
Going out onto the street with a camera, it doesn't really matter how big it is.
un día sábado,
Say, any particular Saturday,
y filmar, describir cómo el autobús llega a la parada, cómo la gente entra y cómo el autobús se va.
it could be showing a bus pulling up at a stop and the people getting on and getting off.
Es una manera de aprender.
And this is a way of learning to work.
O ir a un parque y filmar la gente.
Or go to a park and just film people running about.
O quedarse adentro de la casa
Or stay at home
y filmar una ventana,
and film a window,
el suelo,
ground,
la cocina,
the kitchen,
el techo,
the roof,
la gota que cae en el baño.
some water dripping in a bathroom.
Se puede hacer toda una película misteriosa de una casa vacía.
You could make quite a mysterious film about something as simple as an empty house.
Son espléndidos ejercicios para aprender a hacer documental.
And these are excellent exercises to do in order to learn the documentary filmmaking process.
Son muy entretenidos de hacer.
And they're quite entertaining to do as well.
La descripción, eso es muy importante en el documental.
So description then is very important in the documentary.
Otra cosa interesante es la acción.
So another interesting thing to think about is action.
La gota que está cayendo en el baño
The water dripping in the bathroom,
es acción.
that's action.
Las hojas que se mueven en el jardín,
Leaves rustling in the garden,
acción.
that's action as well.
Muchas veces la acción y la descripción se unen.
And very often action and description come together.
Yo las divido para expresarme mejor.
Personally, I divide them in order to express myself better.
Pero generalmente están juntas.
But generally they come together.
Y si hay una música que se escucha de una radio que hay enfrente,
And if there's music coming from a radio that you see in the shot, say opposite,
es otro agente narrativo que se está uniendo.
that's another narrative agent that's becoming part of it.
Pero para aprender es mejor desglosarlos.
But for the learning process, it's better to think of those things as being separate.
Hemos hablado de la descripción, de la acción, y hay que hablar de los personajes.
So we've talked about description and action, and another point we need to touch on is characters.
Generalmente un documental reposa, está sostenido por personajes.
Generally speaking, it's the characters in a documentary film that give it its grounding.
No es absoluto lo que estoy diciendo.
This isn't a kind of hard and fast rule that I'm saying here.
Hay películas sin personajes.
You can have a documentary film with no people in it at all.
O el personaje puede ser una silla.
Or the character, such as it is, could be a chair.
Pero lo normal es que sea una persona.
But not normally we're talking about people.
Varias personas.
More than one.
6, 7 personas por película de hora y media.
So for a film that would say 90 minutes, you could typically have 6 or 7 key characters in the story.
Elegirlos es un problema.
Choosing who those 6 or 7 are is a problem.
Uno cuando hace un documental conoce mucha gente.
When you're making a documentary, you get to know a lot of people.
Pero ¿quién es el que mejor va a hablar de lo que tú quieres?
But who among them is the one that's going to address best what it is that you're trying to get at?
Es muy común equivocarse.
It can happen often that you make a mistake.
Dedicarle mucho tiempo a una persona que no sabe expresarse bien.
That you spend a lot of time working with somebody who doesn't really know well how to express him or herself.
O que habla demasiado rápido.
Or who talks too quickly.
O una persona que duda mucho.
Or somebody who's got lots of doubts.
Y no se transforma nunca en personaje.
And because of that, never becomes a character.
Es complicado.
And this is complicated.
Pero es un bonito juego de buscar.
But it's ¿cómo decir? Bonito juego.
Desafío.
Desafío.
It's challenging in a
Nice
good way
goal.
to identify who's going to be the people that you want in the film.
Exacto. Y no hay que olvidar que los personajes son muy importantes.
And never lose sight of the fact that the characters in the film are a very important part of it.
Uno los puede entrevistar.
You can interview them.
O uno puede filmar un diálogo de dos personajes.
Or you could film 2 people in dialogue.
Que es estupendo.
Which is fantastic.
Pero es muy difícil que se produzca.
But it's very difficult to have that happen.
Que aparezca en la realidad.
Yeah, that it will just occur naturally that this dialogue will be something that addresses what it is you're trying to capture.
Exacto. Y con eso uno tiene los elementos para hacer una buena filmación.
So you put all those bits together, then you've got the key things that you need, the key ingredients to make a good film.
Descripción, acción y personajes.
Description, action, characters.
Es fácil.
It's easy.
Sí, es verdad.
Yeah, it's true, it is.
Uno tiene tiempo, lo hace de a poco. No hay que correr, hay que conocer a una persona.
You can't rush at these things, you have to get to know somebody.
Hacerse amigo de esa persona.
To befriend them.
O al menos crear una relación de confianza.
Or at least develop a trust relationship.
Y preguntar hasta que la persona comienza a decir lo que uno quiere.
And just keep on and on and on asking questions until the person yields what it is that you're looking for.
Hacer una entrevista es bastante complicado.
Doing an interview is quite complicated.
Primero uno tiene que notarse que uno está tratando de investigar como un policía las cosas.
The first thing you have to get straight is that this kind of interview is not like, say, a policeman trying to interview a witness.
La gente tiene que decir suavemente lo que quiere.
People have to be allowed to say comfortably and at their ease what it is that they want to say.
Y eso depende mucho de uno.
And that depends a lot on the person who's doing the interview.
Es muy bueno crear un clima de confianza.
Ideally what you want to do is to be creating a feeling of trust.
De sencillez, de simpleza.
Of simplicity, of straightforwardness.
hay que ser honesto.
You have to be honest.
No hay que mentir.
Can't lie.
Si uno quiere mentir, hay que confesar la mentira.
And if you want to lie, then you have to confess that you are telling a lie.
No se puede engañar a la gente.
You can't be deceiving people.
No hay que crear un personaje para sacar del otro algo oculto. No sé si está claro.
Inventar para sacar mentiras.
Exacto, no hay que inventar para sacar mentiras. Muy bueno.
You can't have an element of artifice or invention in order to produce lies.
Exacto. Eso se nota enseguida.
Because people will pick up on that straight away.
El primero que se da cuenta es el espectador.
And the first person who will notice that is the viewer.
Y el espectador agradece mucho cuando hay un clima honesto, sincero, claro.
And what you appreciate as a viewer is a sense of honesty and clarity when you're looking at documentary film.
¿Cuántas mujeres has entrevistado para los 8 que quedan en el caso Pinochet?
So Renata asked, how many women did you interview for the 8 that appeared finally in the Pinochet case film?
Hay una película que se conoce poco, mía, que se llama El caso Pinochet.
So the Pinochet case then is one of my films, not particularly well known.
Que es una película sobre el proceso que Pinochet siguió en Londres.
Which is a film about the Pinochet, is it a trial?
Trial?
Yeah, in London.
A trial for extradition.
Yeah, when he was going to be extradited.
Y entrevisté a muchas mujeres.
And I did interviews with a lot of women.
Porque las mujeres expresan mejor que los hombres algunas situaciones duras.
Because women are better than men at explaining certain difficult situations.
Como la tortura.
Like torture.
Como la tortura de un familiar.
For example, a family member who's been tortured.
Como la muerte de otro familiar.
Or the death of a family member.
O cosas que han sufrido ellos.
Or something that they have suffered themselves.
La mujer tiene menos dificultad para hablar de cosas muy dolorosas.
For women, it seems to be easier to speak about things that have been very, very painful.
Generalmente, por supuesto, no siempre se da así.
Obviously, I'm generalizing. It's not always like that.
Y entrevisté en Londres, en España y en Chile 3 grupos de mujeres.
So for that film, I interviewed 3 groups of women, one group in London, another group in Spain, and a third group in Chile.
Porque en esos 3 lugares se hizo el juicio.
Because it was between those 3 places that the trial was happening, or the case was happening.
Y en total eran unas 50.
So altogether, that was 50 interviewees.
Pero en la película solo aparecen 8.
But in the final film, there's only 8 of those 50 that you see.
Que son... es lo mejor de la película.
And the interviews are really the best thing in the film.
Es lejos, es lo mejor.
By a distance.
Después que uno termina el rodaje, pasa al montaje.
So when shooting is finished, then the next thing is moving on to the editing or montage.
Que también tiene sus dificultades.
And that too has its particular difficulties.
Lo primero es establecer una relación con el montador.
So the first thing is to establish a working relationship with your editor.
Uno ve todo el material junto.
You're looking at all the material that you've shot together.
Y hay 2 tipos de montadores.
And there are 2 kinds of editor.
Unos dicen, perfecto, mañana te traigo el esquema de la película.
One kind will say, great, I'll bring you the outline of the film tomorrow morning.
Yo los odio.
I hate those.
Porque el montaje lo hace uno.
Como director.
Sí.
Because the editing is the director's work.
Con el montador.
With the editor.
Pero no uno más que el otro.
But it's not one more than the other.
Yo creo que el montador y el director juntos tienen que explorar cómo van a encontrar el montaje.
So what you want then really is for the editor and the director together to explore how the film is going to flow,
Poco a poco.
bit by bit.
Y luego hay que comenzar a trabajar.
And then the work starts.
Es muy largo,
It's a long process.
mucho más largo que el rodaje.
Usually takes a lot longer than actually shooting the film.
9 meses.
It could be 9 months. for it to
9
itself.
meses, o 8 meses,
Oh,
6 meses.
No.
Y uno avanza 1 minuto, minuto y medio por día.
Pero es un lujo, también hay que decir eso. Sí.
So what you're progressing, say, with this work, a minute and a half per day,
Más o menos.
more or less.
3 minutos,
Some days you might do 3,
otras veces 5,
other times it might be 5 minutes that you get done in a day,
y otras veces nada.
and some days nothing at all.
Uno se pierde.
You get lost in this.
Es un trabajo apasionante,
It's a passionate work,
pero no hay ninguna brújula, no hay ningún instrumento que diga vas bien o vas mal.
but there's no compass that's telling you whether you're going in the right direction or not.
Es complicado,
And that's what makes it complicated,
pero bellísimo.
but also really nice.
Tú estás 8 o 9 horas en la sala de montaje,
So you could be typically on a day 8 or 9 hours working in the editing suite.
encerrado,
They're, enclosed.
en pleno verano,
Midsummer it could be,
y está contento.
but you're happy to be doing that.
Pero el punto final es interesante, hay que tener, si no tú estuvieras hoy todavía montando el botón de la cara.
Sí, bueno, ella se refiere a la estructura. Ella habla de...
Sí, yo
sí,
digo que es importante la pregunta es de poner fin. Es muy importante de saber poner fin.
So the question was about, and this is a really important issue, where do you bring things to a halt? Where's the end point?
Porque si no, yo diría en una manera provocatoria que Patricio hoy en día iba a seguir montando el botón de la cara.
And this is going to be a bit of a tricky thing to say, but I would say if you don't draw a line somewhere, then Patricio would still be working on
Editing.
I can't think what the title of the film is in English.
Pearl button.
The button film now.
Exacto.
No es realmente así, pero eso es para decir que la importancia de tener ese punto, ese marco del film, porque después hay otros trabajos que sí.
So it's not really like that you just go on forever doing something, but you do need to, at some point, draw a line under it so that you can go on to the other things that you want to do and do more work.
Para guiarse en el montaje hay que utilizar el plan dramático tradicional.
So to guide yourself through the working process, it's good to use the traditional dramatic structure.
Hay muchos tipos de planes dramáticos.
And there are all kinds of dramatic plans.
Yo sigo el tradicional,
The one that I follow is the traditional one,
que es presentación,
which is presentation,
desarrollo,
development,
culminación,
the culmination,
desenlace,
the way that things unfold,
final,
and the end.
que es el plan tradicional de prácticamente todas las novelas, obras de teatro, comedias que hemos visto en nuestra vida.
And that essentially is the traditional dramatic structure that underpins most of the media formats that we use to. It could be theatre, comedy, a book. They follow that plan.
Que es muy eficaz.
And that's the case because it's a very effective plan. That 7 or 8 months of the editing, that's how that process works.
Y la obra adquiere consistencia.
And that's where the work, or the film, is becoming a coherent entity.
Hay otros factores también que influyen,
There are other factors that play a role here.
que son los elementos que uno coloca en la película.
And I'm talking here about the elements that one puts into the film.
La música, por ejemplo.
Music, for example.
Es muy importante la música. Bueno, ¿para qué les voy a decir? muy importante.
I probably don't need to tell you, but of course the music that you use in the film is really important.
El ideal es poner poca música.
Ideally, you want to use music sparingly.
El problema es cuándo,
And the question you're asking is where, when to put it in the film.
dónde,
Whereabouts in the film.
cuánto debe durar.
And for how long would the music last.
No es posible definir.
And there's no simple definition or answer to that.
Depende de cada uno de ustedes.
It depends on each one of you.
El ideal es utilizar músicas por 3, 4, 5 instrumentos.
Ideally, you would want music that's using between, say, 3 and 5 instruments.
Música de cámara.
Chamber music.
La música sinfónica, por supuesto que se puede usar, pero es difícil.
You could use symphonic music. It's possible, but it's also difficult.
Hay que usarla a veces, pocas veces.
Again, you use that sparingly, now and again.
El ideal es una orquesta de cámara.
Ideally, what you want is a chamber group.
Porque la imagen documental es siempre un frágil.
Because the documentary image is a fragile thing.
Es un tipo de cine frágil.
It's a fragile sort of filmmaking.
Hay películas documentales que retratan grandes acontecimientos con millones de personas. Sí.
There are films that will narrate really, really big events with millions of people in them.
Pero lo normal es hacer películas mucho más pequeñas.
But the normal practice is to make films whose scope is much more reduced than that.
Lo que no significa que sean menores, pueden ser grandes películas.
That doesn't mean that they are minor films for all that. They can be significant films.
Y en ese caso la orquesta tiene que ser mediana.
And in that case, what you want is a medium-sized group of instruments.
O un solo instrumento, el piano es ideal.
Or just one instrument.
Otro elemento importante es el archivo.
So another important element is archive material.
Exacto. Que aparece, la película lo exige.
And the film will demand that.
Y si hay archivo hay que ponerlo.
And if you've got archive materials, you need to use them.
Y que hay que usarlo con mucha cautela.
But you have to use them very carefully.
Hay personas que lo dejan mudo, sin sonido.
Some filmmakers will have a film that's completely silent.
No está mal.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Hay otros que ponen el ruido de una proyectora antigua.
And some filmmakers, over the kind of archive material we're talking about here, will have the sound of, the typical sound of an old movie projector.
Muy malo.
That's bad as well.
Y, en fin, cada trozo documental de archivo requiere un tratamiento delicado.
So, anytime you're using some archive elements in the film, you need to approach this very carefully about how you integrate them into the film.
Luego está el problema de la banda de sonido.
So, another thing then that the filmmaker needs to think about is the soundtrack.
Que es difícil.
And that is difficult.
Tiene que ser muy sobrio. Sobrio.
Oh, it has to be very sober.
Sí. No es bueno meter ruidos, efectos, la lluvia que cae, rayos, truenos. No.
What you don't want is really dramatic sounds like thunderclaps and massive rainstorms.
Es mejor mantenerse en un nivel cauteloso, sobrio.
It's better to use it in moderation, I think would be a way of saying that, to take a very sober approach. Como en el botón de NASCAR, con la lluvia, el sonido de la gota que cae sobre el techo de zinc.
Exactamente.
So an example, I think, is in the film that's following this, which is where Patricio talks about all the memories that are evoked by hearing the rain fall on the zinc roof, which was one of your experiences when you lived in that part of Chile.
Y con tu ejemplo has hablado del silencio.
So another example then is when you talk about silence.
El silencio es muy bueno en el documental.
Silence is a good thing in a documentary.
Cuando de repente no se oye nada.
When suddenly you don't hear anything.
O un pequeño aire suave por allá al fondo.
Or Or just the faintest trace of the sound of a breeze in the distance.
Es muy bueno el silencio.
That and silence is a very good thing. So an example of a kind of an effective use of silence is in the Pearl Button, where there are some rostrum shots of photographs, archived material of an indigenous a group of indigenous people, and throughout the scene where you're seeing the sequence of those photographs, there's nothing on the soundtrack at all.
Bueno, y después viene la mezcla de sonido.
Right, so the next stage in the process is the sound mix,
Que es apasionante,
and that is great fun,
porque uno ve por primera vez la película
because you're seeing the finished film for the first time,
con todos los ruidos
with all the sound effects or noise,
y es un placer.
and that's a pleasurable experience.
Y hay que tener mucha cautela con el volumen que uno le da a cada cosa.
And you need to pay special attention to the volume that you are attributing to each element in the soundtrack.
Pero es un momento maravilloso.
But it's a really good moment at that point in the process.
Tú te das cuenta ahí si la película vale o no vale.
That's when you realise, is this film going to work or not?
Es complicado porque a veces el resultado es negativo.
It's complicated in the sense that potentially the outcome is that it doesn't work at that stage.
Y no hay nada que hacer.
In that case, there's nothing that you can do.
Ya está todo definido.
Because by that stage in the process, you've got everything done.
Pero bueno, lo normal es que ocurra lo contrario.
But, generally speaking, it's the opposite that happens.
Y es un momento de alegría porque es la primera vez que uno ve la película.
And it's a moment of real happiness because it's the first time that you're seeing the film.
Y eso es más o menos lo que yo tenía pensado para esta charla.
And that's more or less is what I had in mind for this talk.
Si desean hacerme preguntas, con mucho gusto.
You talked before about filming about a tree, and that you should love the tree, and then you should get further and further back to get a wider perspective. Yeah, and I'm just wondering for you, living away from Chile for 30 years, how that kind of works, because you're talking about this little strip of land between the ocean and the mountains and the desert, and you've got a perspective from away, but you go back to Chile to shoot. So could you just talk a little bit about how that's formed your perspective about the films you make?
Exactamente, no lo sé.
I couldn't tell you exactly.
El hecho de vivir lejos hace que tú veas mejor tu país.
The fact that you are living far away gives you una visión más nítida, clara.
Sí.
So it gives you a clearer perspective.
Pero no en todos los terrenos.
But not on over all terrains.
Porque cuando uno vive lejos hay cosas que uno no ve.
Because from the very fact of living at a distance, there are these things that you don't see.
Uno está ausente de esa realidad.
You're absent from that reality.
No sabe qué circunstancias políticas o qué opiniones, lo que los diarios dicen en el momento mismo.
You're not there at that precise moment of time to be aware of a political development or what the papers are saying on a particular day, for example.
Uno es un ausente.
You are an absentee.
Pero la ausencia
But absence
da una gran posibilidad para captar lo mejor.
gives you lots of possibility for capturing the best.
Y eso es lo que yo hago.
And that's what I do.
Mi cine no es un cine de precisión,
My cinema isn't a cinema of precision.
es de ambiente.
It's about an atmosphere.
Uno puede saber lo que pasa en Chile si ve en Botón de Nada,
You can get a sense of what's going on in Chile from watching the Pearl Button,
pero indirectamente.
but indirectly.
I'd like to thank the British Film Institute, the Film Audience Network, Film Cymru Wales and Cardiff University, all of whom supported this event. Patricio and particularly I think Ryan, who did a great job with the translation. So if you could just give them another round of applause.
que soy yo quien debería hacer.
Sorry.